First of all, I think the summit is still likely to go on. I think the only thing that would interrupt that would be if the war continues on through the end of the month and it is causing real problems for the United States, and Trump feels he can't leave the country and go to China while the war is still raging. Hopefully, that's not going to be the case. But my view is that when Xi Jinping is thinking about what he's going to say to Donald Trump, tariffs, I think, are not at the top of his agenda, because the tariffs that he's seen over the last year or so really haven't had a dramatic impact on the Chinese economy. I think he's not that focused on it. China's exports to the rest of the world did just fine last year, even though they were down considerably to the United States. I think Xi Jinping's focus is going to be on how do we give Donald Trump the pomp and circumstance, the TV visuals that he loves. And then he'll go home happy, and Donald Trump will remain the most accommodating person towards China in all of Washington, D.C.
Wow. Okay, that I got to see. But yeah, you're making the point that photo ops are important for the Chinese side as well. But back to the state of the Chinese economy. This whole thing about needing and wanting to pivot from investment to consumption, that's been around for years, as you well know, Andy. Theoretically, this is something they should do, and a lot of economists have tried to model out, look, how much could increased consumption help growth in China? And it's actually it's a fair chunk. But, from what you've seen so far, would it be fair to say that that doesn't seem to be, it's what they're saying and theoretically what we know, but from what they're actually doing, it doesn't seem as though they're serious? Because, credit isn't going to property or real estate, we know that. We certainly do know it is continuing to go very heavily into industry and also into manufacturing. And, consumption and even services, that's getting sort of short shrift. Is that fair?
Well, I would look at it a slightly different way. First of all, I think it's really important to recognize that not all that long ago, say prior to 2020, consumption was the key engine of China's economic growth. Consumption, as I said before, was driving about 2/3 of economic growth. The consumer story was booming. So it's important to recognize that Xi Jinping is not anti-consumer. I think what's happened in the last 5 years, which has knocked consumption off its track, so that in 2024, for example, consumption was only about 45% of GDP growth. That came back to about 50% last year, still too weak. But I don't think it was because the government became anti-consumption. I think it was because they made a series of really serious policy mistakes, regulatory crackdowns on everything from property to internet platforms and video games and electronic cigarettes and education and pharmaceuticals. All of these led to a collapse in confidence among entrepreneurs. And the average urban Chinese consumer is either an entrepreneur herself or works for an entrepreneur. So I think it's been a cascade of events that weren't designed to slow consumption. If you look at the speeches that Xi Jinping has been giving over the last year, it's all about domestic demand and consumption, and he almost never mentions exports.
Okay. Should go back and take a look at some of that stuff. The big thing in China now, obviously, and it's going to be talked about at the NPC and also in the new 5-year plan, is almost a all of government, all of country effort, all in on AI. And from what we understand, what's happening there is a little unusual in the sense that whenever we've seen heavy concentration on certain industries in the past, let's say solar panels or for that matter EVs, and we're still seeing that, it's become like hunger wars, right? Intense cutthroat competition, and Beijing stands back and goes, okay, kill yourselves. We want to see who's left standing. You're the champion because you deserve it. We're not seeing exactly the same thing happen in AI though, because there's a much more collaborative approach happening, we understand. Competitors, so-called competitors, are working very closely with each other. What accounts for this sort of change, do you think?
Well, my understanding is there's still cutthroat competition among the Chinese AI companies, just like there is among the robotics companies, the EV companies, and the battery companies. So I think it's fair to assume that in the near term, the impact of this is going to be margins are going to be really, really tight for companies in these spaces. But the longer term prospects are that this is going to drive growth. And one thing that's impressed me, I was in Shenzhen with investors a few months ago, talking to companies in these spaces. One thing that impressed me is that when I listen to the rhetoric here in the United States, often in AI and robots, it's about pie in the sky things that might happen 20 years from now to have robots be smarter than humans. But when I talk to companies in China, it's more grounded. It's about how do we build a robot or how do we use AI to help companies be more efficient and more profitable. And so when you see 400 million Chinese watching the Lunar New Year TV show and watching robots doing these incredible kung fu moves, I think that's part of the company's efforts to figure out how do we make robots in a dark warehouse for Tencent be more efficient and help the company make more money.